read a quote before the break about the need for leaders to stand on principle. But on the flip side of this, Franklin D. Roosevelt said, a good leader can't get too far ahead of his followers. Warren Mundine, where should a leader draw the line with public opinion? I mean, should a leader listen to public opinion? Should they be driven by public opinion? Should they ignore public opinion if their principled position is at odds with where the public are? How do you find and draw this line?
Look, whether it's politics or business, you've got to listen to your customers. You've got to understand your clients. You've got to understand the constituency out there. And you've got to focus on what their needs and that are. So whether they want something and you've got different principles in regard to that, it's about then understanding them and getting your message across, selling your message, communicating and working with them, and then moving through that process to getting to the end goal at the end of it.
But do you also have to change the product, change the message along the way, or not?
Look, there's many ways to skin a cat, but you've got to be honest. The first thing you've got to do is be honest, and you've got to believe in what you're trying to get the message across. Some of the things I find today in regard to politics and even in business areas, that some people actually don't believe what they're selling, and they get out there and they sell it, and the public aren't stupid. I'm a great believer in the honesty, integrity of the public, and they get it right pretty much all the time, if not all the time. And they can smell an Indian oil salesman a mile away. And so it's about you've got to really listen to it. You don't have to sit there and have polls, and before you give policy, you have polls about this. Will the public like this? Will the public not like this? No, you come into the Parliament. You've got a lifetime of experiences. You've got a lifetime of ideas. You're there to do something for the Australian people.
But if over a long period of time those polls aren't moving, that it's a clearly entrenched view, and getting back to that carbon
well,
tax
you shouldn't
example,
have got there quite frankly, you shouldn't have got there in the first place. You need to be listening and focusing and working with your constituents, and you've got to be doing that. And then look. I'll use my own example. When I elect a person, sometimes I don't quite understand where they're taking me, but I trust them because I know that they've got integrity, they're honest. They actually believe in what they're trying to do. So I give them a little bit of a leeway and I say, I trust you to take us to this spot. I'm not too sure what you're on about, but I'll take you. And I think a lot of people operate that way. They don't sort of sit there and measure and check everything you say or everything you're about. It's about having that, and you've got to build that up in the beginning. If you don't have that as a base, then you're not. No matter, you could sell the best policy in the world, but it's not going to fly.
Cardinal Pell, it's not just in politics where leaders are often at odds with public opinion, in the church as well. There's public pressure over the church's position on things like the ordination of women, abortion, contraception and the like. Again, where do you draw the line in listening to what the public is saying or just digging in on a position?
Well, you've always got to listen, but that doesn't mean to say you have to agree with what you're hearing. And it might mean, and you also got to listen to try to work out what arguments are effective and what arguments are completely counterproductive. But the church, with a traditional Christian church, we haven't got much room to manoeuvre on all sorts of things, even though we know that they might be quite unpopular.
But that won't matter as much, is what you're saying for the church.
No, no, it doesn't. For example, I'm not up for re-election. That's why at one stage I was able to say things about climate change that probably, unless you were from the country, no urban politician was game to say. A bishop's job is a tiny bit like a judge. He's got to maintain the rule of law, maintain the tradition in the Christian churches. My job as a bishop is to try to explain the tradition, maintain it, hand it on. And some parts of Christian teaching have never been popular.
In Chapel, when you were captain, there was some criticism of the sledging that went on under your watch. There was public concern about that. Did that matter to you, and did you feel the need to respond at all?
Well, I didn't feel the need to change that because it wasn't happening. That was the first thing. But, I mean, your constituents are pretty easy to keep happy as far as cricket team is concerned, because if you're winning, they're happy. I think as far as criticism is concerned, I always feel that you set your standards pretty high, and you probably set them higher than the public. So if you maintain your standards, then you don't have to worry about too much about what the public are saying. And as I say, if you're winning, then you'll keep them pretty happy.
Richo, politics is a bit different, though, isn't it? If the polls are against you, and you're just digging in because, well, as Julia Gillard says, this is the right thing to do for the nation, the carbon tax, there is a point at which it could all come unstuck.
Depends upon the issue. I mean, I think I've always taken the view that there are some issues that are so important, that are so fundamental, that even if you're going to be unpopular, you stick to them. I think the best example is going back to Gough Whitlam and the issue of the Vietnam War. If you go back to him as an opposition leader, he took that argument on. Now, the Vietnam War was immensely popular in the mid-60s. Everyone forgets that. Now they just remember the end of it in 73. But it took Whitlam years to convince Australia that he believed that was so fundamental that there's no way he would ever compromise on it. That was just it. And he was right. And so there are some issues that are so important that it doesn't matter what the polls say, you've got to stick to your guns. On the other hand, when the issue isn't that big a deal, I think you're crazy if you simply ignore what the electorate's telling you. If overwhelmingly they want something, you're an idiot if you don't do it.
And that applies to the carbon tax?
Well, I think as far as the carbon tax is concerned, I think there's two minds. People are worried about climate change, less so than they were a few years ago because it hasn't been sold very well. That having been said, the carbon tax is immeasurably unpopular, and it does have to have some degree of reality in the world. 2 years ago, you might have been able to get away with $23. Today, 10's about as high as you can go. She needs to change.
Neil Flett, a few people have said it comes down to selling that message better. What would be your advice then to the Prime Minister on this particular issue about how to sell it better?
I think Australians today have never been as well educated, and we have more information than we've ever had before coming at us from all directions. So the public's pretty knowledgeable, and I think we can spot spin in seconds. And so we get very uncomfortable when we see our leaders looking uncomfortable because saying things that they didn't write themselves, and you get the feeling they don't believe them themselves. And as soon as that happens, I think we switch off and we stop listening, and I think that's what's happening. So I'd really urge leaders to use less spin and just tell us. And if you get it wrong, well, I think we'd listen more.
Christine Milner, I see you nodding there. Do you think that this has been a problem for the Prime Minister in particular?
Well, I think it comes down to passion. If you think something is that important, as Richo just said, then you get out there and you explain to people why it's so important, why this action is necessary. There is a really critical argument to be had about the impact of climate change, but more particularly as well, the need to transform Australia to be competitive in this century in a low-carbon economy, all the good things that can happen from this country with innovation, new jobs, new industries and the like.
But the PM says all of that, and you guys say all of that, but
it's about the passion that you actually have for it and the ability to communicate that. And I think that's one of the issues that we've got at the moment, that there hasn't been the passion or the communication to get that message out there. And the other thing is about authenticity. You know, people say, as you would have heard before, is this the real Julia? Who is the real Kevin? I think the community do have a sense of who is this person, how much is perception, what does the real person think here, and we need to have more of that. But the media, I have to say, is one of the things that constrains people from actually being authentic with the public.
Well, let's tease that out, because that's an interesting point. Harold Mitchell, do you agree that the media has some blame here? I mean, it is a fair point that the media is often obsessed by the opinion poll cycle.
Well, that part is true, but that can be cut across in every way. Just to take up the point there, at some points I'd have to see in the business world, we don't get elected every 3, 4, or 6 years. We get elected every day. If you're not getting it right, you lose whatever custom that you had. And so we live in a world of responsibility like you wouldn't believe. We have to do that, isn't it? We have to go into question time. That happens every day in every way. The point is, at a certain point, at a certain time, if the message that you think you're telling, nobody's listening. Nobody's listening, and that happens well before you ever understand it. You might have all the passion that you have in the world, but if they're not listening, it's wrong, it won't happen, move on from there. That's the world that we live in. That's what I was saying before. In the world of business, we have to perform every minute. every minute about everything, and we get measured like you wouldn't believe. And if we have a passionate, stupid idea, that's what it is. It's still a stupid idea.
Jenny, you would have seen media and public pressure on things in the education world as well, whether it's a scandal in a school or something like that. How do you deal with that? Do you simply ignore it, as we've discussed? Do you stick by a pattern of behaviour, even though it may be unpopular?
Yeah, I think you just try to do what's right. I think you have to listen to people, because there's no... I will always be a better leader because I listen to so many different opinions and try to work out what's right. But in the end, you have to do what you think's right. And people trust, I think, people who they know will listen and then make decisions, people of integrity. So I'll always just try to do what's right, not what I think is going to look good in the media.
And Ken Gillespie, Defence has also from time to time been offside with public opinion. There's been criticism of Defence leadership over the culture in the military, attitudes to women. A lot of this came up around the issue of the ADFA Skype issue as well. George Pell talked about the church being different to politics in the sense that you're not elected every 3 years. And I guess it's a bit the same in Defence, isn't it, as well? How do you respond to public pressure on some of these things? Can you ignore it, or do you need to show some response?
No, I don't think you can ignore public pressure. I think one of the earlier statements said that for the society to run effectively, it needs to have a set of values by which to live. And the ADF enjoys a special place in our community in that under our constitution, it's the only group in the country that's able to deliver premeditated lethal force. It's a really onerous responsibility. And so the Defence Force needs to live up to a set of standards like nobody else in the country. And so I don't mind that we're held to a higher level of account along those lines. But sometimes I think that we're treated unfairly in the process. So I think there has been so much focus on the Skype issue at the present time that it detracts from the fact that 99% of the Defence Force and young people in the defence organisation are good Australians doing a good job for the country.
It's part of the reason for that Defence and Defence leadership doesn't do enough to sell that story, to talk about those good things that are being done, the 99% of people who are very happy in the military. We don't hear about that. I mean, is it the media's fault, or is it the Defence Force's fault?
I think there's a sort of a shared blame there. I think that we've been a bit of a secret society for a long time, but I think the reality of it is that right now, in that media environment, the leaders in the Defence Force aren't in control of the organisation's reputation. It's in the hands of others, and I think we need to stop that.
In the hands of?
Well, I think it's in the hands of some people who nominate themselves as commentators. There's people speak quite freely about a whole range of reports that none of them have ever seen in that process. And all it does is detract from, what Father Chris is saying here, is that we've got some fabulous young people working in the country, and they get tarred with this brush of the 1% who don't get it. And we will always have 1% that don't get it.
Peter Beattie, what do you think about this role of the media in reflecting organisations like Defence, or indeed the Church, but most importantly politics? Is the media to blame for this lack of respect for leadership at the moment?
Look, I think what's changed in the media is that we now have a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour media cycle, and that has changed politics dramatically. One of the things it's actually done is exhaust politicians, that they are constantly on beck and call, and frankly, I don't care how smart anyone is, one day you'll make a mistake. And what will happen is that will be repeated and repeated and repeated. I mean, it'll be the headline on Sky television for the next 3 days if someone's made a goof. Now, that is putting standards on human beings. It doesn't matter whether they're politicians or church leaders or cricket captains or leaders of the defence, which frankly is unrealistic.
So are leaders therefore responding by confining themselves or being far more careful?
People talk about spin and they criticise politicians for it. I just say to them, wake up to the real world. What are politicians going to do? You're in a bunker, you're being shot at every day. Of course you're going to find a way to deal with it. I mean, wake up. This is what politicians do. It's called human instinct. Now, is it right? No, of course not. But the problem is bad news sells. We all know that, and that will catch the attention. Now, I'm not blaming the media. I'm not doing that at all. I'm a great believer in that you should be transparent, you should be open, you should share it as much as possible. But I think we have unreasonable expectations of our public figures, and the problem, David, with that is if we keep doing it, we're going to get less and less good people who want to go into public life. You'll end up with the second-raters all the time, and out of that you end up with bad government.
Richo, do you agree with that?
Much of it, yeah. I think one of the problems is that there's such pressure now on politicians. It's not simply about the decisions they make. It's their personal life. It's their family's life. So often, especially in recent times in Queensland, I think that was a big issue. And so it's very hard to convince people to go into public life if they're successful. They're earning 2 or 3 times what a poly earns, but it's more than the money. You go in there and you become an open target. There's just a target painted on your back and your front and everywhere else, and everyone's shooting at you. And of course you're going to do your best to avoid getting shot. That's something I think they teach you in the army. Probably General Gillespie can tell us more about that than I can.
Harold Mitchell, you said at the outset that one of the key assets of a leader is inspiration, the ability to inspire.
Yeah.
Is it constrained by the current media environment, do you think?
Well, I defend the media, not as you'd expect, but because if you're in public life, the public own you. Just get used to it. That's the way it is. No use complaining about any of that. But what I always say about leadership is that people want a vision. You won't get to where you think you might going to be unless you say that's what it is, and that's got to be over a long period of time. In Victoria, we had a particular leader who had to blast through. Jeff Kennett. I was there at the time that he did it. He did a whole lot of things which might have been considered unpopular, but he raised taxes. He said this will be very hard to do. We've got a big debt. We have to do, and he explained it, and he took the people along with it, and that was very important. He had the absolute vision. We will build. We will do. You've got to pay for it, and we understand it. In Jeff's case, there's one problem I think that I saw somewhere on the list, which is how long should you stay? Probably it was a year or so longer than he should have, I'd have to say. But he said, here's the vision of where we're going, and then people understood it and he sold it to them.
Well, dealing with negative public opinion is one thing, but another challenge, tough test for a leader really, is how to admit when you've made a mistake. How do you admit when you've done something wrong? After the break, we're going to explore that. Ken Gillespie will be asking you about mistakes that have been made, perhaps in the military. Stay with us.